Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CIRA's third virtual event of the year, which it is titled Battling Botnets, a Security Balancing Act. My name is Hannah Daly, and I'm the Deputy Editor of The Wire Report, which is an online publication that covers topics such as botnets. I'll be moderating this panel and asking questions to the guests that CIRA has invited to participate. As people have been forced to move nearly every aspect of their lives online over the past year and a half, the importance of staying safe while online has become amplified. Malware and phishing attempts are on the rise, and we're seeing how hackers are able to disrupt online properties and real-world manufacturing and critical infrastructure. So, today we're going to discuss how we could deal with this perceived rise in cyber threats. Recently, the CRTC launched a consultation on a proposed framework to address botnets, which are harmful networks of malware-infected computers that are often used in cyber attacks. The CRTC has suggested that it typically can't handle botnet-facilitated attacks at their source because they most often originate outside of Canada, but that it does have the authority or mandate to use regulatory mechanisms to address the issue. So while many industry observers seem to agree that botnets are harmful, there's not really a clear consensus on the best remedy or whether or not the government should be mandating it. So what should be done to protect Canadians online? And should blocking be mandated at the ISP level, or should Canadians be responsible for their own protection? Or are there other options? To attempt to answer these questions and more, CIRA has put together an expert panel from across the industry to have a discussion on this aspect of the future of internet security in Canada. So before we get started, if you have any questions for today's panelists, we're going to be using an app called Social QA. You can go to socialqa.cira.ca to enter your questions on your mobile device, tablet, or computer. Once there, you can add your own questions and upvote others that you want to see asked. Questions are going to be chosen based on popularity, so the audience will get to determine what is asked during the Q&A portion later on in this event. And of course, I will ask that you please keep your questions respectful, on topic, and concise so that we can fit in as many as possible. Now, to start the conversation, CIRA would like to ask the audience a couple of questions to see what you think about the topic of botnet blocking. So there are two poll questions to put forward. After I introduce each one, you should see a pop-up on your screen that will allow you to vote, and each question will be live for about 1 minute. So the first question is, do you think ISPs, or internet service providers, should be required to block known malicious botnets on their networks? Your options are yes or no. Now, while you take the time to vote, I can tell you a bit more about what I plan on chatting about today with the panelists. We've got 4 people with expertise in the telecom sector, cybersecurity, and more. I intend to ask them about their varying perspectives on blocking botnets, as well as why they believe this conversation is happening now. We've seen support and criticism for the CRTC's proposal, but conversations such as this one today might help people wade through the information that's out there, because there are varying options and a variety of opinions. I also want to ask the panelists what they think is the best way to protect against botnets and what the results of certain methods may be, in addition to asking what other jurisdictions may be doing. So hopefully you've had a chance to answer the first question, and now we can get ready for the second. Now, the second question is, do you feel that enough is being done by the government to protect Canadians from malware and malicious websites online? Again, your options are yes or no. So as I give you some time to answer this question, I can tell you a bit more about the CRTC's consultation. It was launched not too long ago, and the CRTC said that ransomware attacks facilitated by malicious botnets are of a particular concern, because of the significant service disruptions and financial damages that they can cause. So there are 3 common techniques for network-level blocking, being domain-based blocking, where infected devices are blocked from accessing blacklisted domains, Internet protocol-based blocking, which uses a firewall to prevent communication to the IP addresses of suspected command and control servers, and protocol-based blocking, which is a more targeted form of IP-based blocking. So once again, I'll give you a bit more time to finish answering that question, and I'll share the results later so that you have an idea of what the other people are thinking. Now, let's introduce the panelists. So first, we've got Mark Buell, and Mark is the Regional Vice President in North America with the Internet Society. We've also got Byron Holland, who is CIRA's President and CEO. As well, we've got Andy Kaplan-Murth, who is the Vice President of Regulatory and Carrier Affairs for TechSavvy. And finally, we have Leah Mikalopoulos, who is the Director of Government Relations with the Canadian Electricity Association. So now let's get into what the panelists think. So welcome everybody, thank you for being here. And I want to start off the conversation with the CRTC's botnet consultation that has caused the debate to heat up. So why is it that you think that the CRTC has decided to come out with this consultation, and why now? Anybody want to jump on that one?
We're all too polite Canadians here, I can see that. Sure, I'll jump or start on that one, because I'm sure there's a lot of opinions around this table. But in terms of why the CRTC may be doing it right now, I think that there is certainly considerable concern in the general internet population, or the general population, since almost everybody is an internet user, about the number of malicious activities that we're seeing happen online, whether it's botnets in specific, or more generally malware, and then kind of the subset of malware, ransomware, and all the other kinds of malicious activity that are taking place on the internet, and to some degree kind of breaching the trust that we as end users have for the internet itself. And governments have a role in ensuring the stability and security of the internet, but it's a challenge for governments. Where do they do that? How do they do that? As a telecoms regulator, the CRTC could be perceived as a somewhat natural place for that. So I think that there's pressure on government to act, to do something, and then also, where do they do that something? And that's probably where we're seeing pressure on the CRTC to start to investigate how can we start to protect Canadians, hence the consultation.
Perfect. So bouncing from that, there has been, like I said earlier, a variety of opinions coming in on this, and I know that some of you here have, within your organizations, at least submitted interventions on this consultation. So there's certainly quite a bit of conversation going on, but I also want to ask, what is it that makes blocking botnets controversial? You know, why are there such a variety of opinions on this?
Yeah, maybe I'll step in. I think actually the most interventions in this consultation, there was a general consensus that at least mandated network level botnet blocking was not the place to start. ISPs at least generally agreed on that, and there's not usually a lot of consensus among all ISPs. I think the CRTC is also interested in this at this time. Well, at least so CASL was the Canada's anti-spam law, came into force now 6 years ago, I think it is. And that was sort of a foothold, at least, as a way to start trying to address malware, which they see as the source of botnets. It has, obviously not stopped the proliferation of botnets and the harm that comes from botnets, and so they're looking at taking the next step. Part of the picture at the CRTC, I think, is that there's been a move toward increased regulatory intervention to address malicious phone calls. So they have a number of proceedings going on to address or to require call blocking, or to allow service providers to do call blocking. And they may see this as sort of an analogous regulatory intervention that is needed on the internet side. And then I think the third part of the picture for at least why this might be happening now is that there seems to be an increased level of comfort with regulating traffic on the internet. I mean, regulating the internet. I don't think this can be seen in isolation from other, government interventions. Bill C-10 comes to mind. The expected legislation to address harmful Content online comes to mind. We don't know quite what that looks like yet. Possible site blocking to enforce copyright comes to mind here, both through the courts, which is already happening, and possibly through government. So there seems to be this trend toward regulating content, and that may have been sort of an opportunity for the CRTC to wade into, how that applies to botnets as well.
And that's something else I wanted to talk about actually is, as far as I can tell, looking at this from a journalist perspective, it does seem to be that the public is paying a bit more attention to what the government is doing right now. So talking about that trend that you mentioned, do you think that's part of the reason maybe why, or are people just becoming with time more conscious of their experience online and how it can be affected by government?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that this is popular. I don't think this is coming from some sort of increased awareness or popular demand. It seems to me that this is concern at the CRTC and sort of thinking about what can we do about this. I think there's always been concern in the public about malware, about botnets, but I don't see like a popular clamoring for people's ISPs to start blocking blocking botnets. There are lots of services that are available to people if they're looking for ways to block botnets that they could do. I don't think that that's where this is coming from.
Okay. And before I move on from the, public perception of it, the results from the poll earlier, I can share those now. So again, the first question was, do you think ISPs should be required to block known malicious botnets on their networks? 77% of you said yes, and 33% said no. And the second question was, do you feel that enough is being done by the government to protect Canadians from malicious websites online? And again, the 19% of you said yes, and 81% of you said no. So moving on from that, I do want to talk a bit about the, different provisions that were mentioned in the CRTC's consultation, being protections for corrections for false positives with blocking, unbiased blocking decisions, and other things like that. Could provisions like this ease concerns and calls for transparency that were present in some of the interventions and criticism? Do you think that would be enough?
Yeah, it's Mark. I don't necessarily think that would be enough. I mean, we came out against the CRTC's proposal for fundamentally a couple of reasons. First, we're not against content blocking. I need to put that up front. And content blocking can be a very useful tool in the cybersecurity toolbox, albeit a tool of last resort. The problem with the CRTC's proposal is that they didn't propose a toolkit. They proposed a last resort approach, right? And we know that blocking alone won't solve the problem. It's reactive. When a threat's detected, it's blocked. It's really a piecemeal incident-based approach, which is inefficient and will ultimately be ineffective. Botnets mutate, servers move. We'll always just be playing a game of whack-a-mole. So it's somewhat an inefficient way to do things. It's not a best practice that we've seen worldwide, and there are also risks involved with content blocking. We know from international experience that where content blocking has been mandated in other parts of the world, over-blocking occurs. You spoke a bit about IP blocking. If the harmful content that needs to be blocked shares an IP address with legitimate content, all of it gets blocked. And second, we have a legitimate fear of scope creep. We're worried about that this proposal, if implemented, could set a dangerous precedent that could lead to using content blocking for other reasons, such as copyright enforcement.
Okay. And something else I noticed, I believe also in the Internet Society's intervention, was the potential for opting in or opting out options for consumers. How would that affect whatever framework may be in place, and is that something that should be included, do you think?
Well, we don't think that a top-down mandated approach, which the CRTC has proposed, would be the most effective way to do this. We really think it should be, the CRTC should take much more of a collaborative security approach to mitigating the harms of botnets. And by that I mean, take an approach which recognizes that we all have a role to play in ensuring that the internet as a whole is secure, from end users to domain registries like CIRA to ISPs like TechSavvy, and that a voluntary, bottom-up, multi-stakeholder driven process to address this very serious issue would be much more effective than a top-down piecemeal approach.
Okay. And say that were to be the way in the end that the CRTC would go, if this approach that you're suggesting were to take place, is there a way you would recommend that it starts? How that conversation would begin compared to this consultation that's happening now?
Well, I mean, with anything cybersecurity, collaboration is key. So, if you look at I'll go back to, in 2008, after the Conficker worm, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security released a set of recommendations and lessons learned. And what they realized from how the Conficker worm was dealt with was that, we need to address the overall threat environment. It's not just a question of here's botnets, we'll address that this way, here's this, we'll address that way. So the FCC took up the recommendations and they developed essentially an voluntary anti-botnet code for ISPs. And in that, a fundamental part of that is collaboration, ability for ISPs, domain name registries, and others are best practices and information with each other. It becomes much more of a stronger approach because it's much more ground up, right? It's ISPs who are experiencing the same challenges working together to solve them, right? And in typical U.S. government fashion, those types of interventions are really developed through multi-stakeholder processes, which, if you have an interest, if you have a need to ensure the issue is addressed, you come to the table and you work on it.
Okay. And this has been alluded to a bit already, but some ISPs, they say they've been already doing some work to block botnets, or they've got their own means of handling the issue. So I guess, where would this framework fall with that? Are you expecting, it's mandated, right? So it's not really a choice, but would it be regulating and forcing them to change what they're already doing? Or is it varied right now with ISPs in terms of what they're doing? Like how would it really change what's happening now?
I think one of the important things to note right now is, and you just alluded to it, Anna, is that ISPs are already blocking and managing traffic. They're just doing it of their own accord without any particular framework or any independent oversight. And that's not to say that there's any malintent there. They are managing their networks to the best of their ability, including blocking malicious traffic, but left up to their own devices with, like I say, no oversight. When it comes back to the CRTC's consultation here, I think we also have to remember that they're not asking whether they should be developing a framework, but rather looking for insights into one. And that, in large part, is what we at CIRA are trying to comment on. Because as an operator of some of the core internet and critical internet resources for all of Canada, we are both subject to the kinds of attacks that we're talking about and protecting people from and businesses from those kinds of attacks as well. And also as a entity involved in the policy environment around this space, we have also an interest from the policy perspective. So I think we come to it from the operator and the policy perspective. And from the operator side, what we are, I think, all concerned about is bad actors' ability to weaponize the network itself against the network. And that very specific and limited remit is where there's an opportunity to have a framework that does, I think, a few things. First off, it lets ISPs operate their networks to the best effect possible. And to that end, it should probably also be a voluntary framework followed by ISPs, not a mandatory framework. Because then I think we could get into the jurisdictional issues of the CRTC here, but maybe we'll leave that for a different conversation. But it probably has to be voluntary. There no doubt need to be some opt-out mechanisms here. But primarily, it needs to have some independent oversight. It can't just be the ISPs doing it themselves. There has to be a framework, there has to be some oversight, some guardrails that we all abide by, all the ISPs and potentially other DNS and infrastructure operators. And I think when you come to the block lists themselves, like, how do we know what to block? I mean, that's a very thorny question unto itself, but there also can't be a single point of failure. There have to be more than one entity that provides accepted block lists. So I think that's another important part here. It could help make a framework livable, fair, transparent. And the framework should also be guided by, obviously, some core principles around transparency, around non-discrimination. Proportionality is the other big one. What are we doing here? Especially for those of us who operate core parts of the internet, you know, our technology is a blunt instrument, and it can have broader, unanticipated consequences. You know, this is the classic sledgehammer to kill a fly kind of solution. So we need to be very careful about proportionality and necessity, and is this the right place to do it? If we think about the technology stack and where we as, where the ISPs and CIR as a DNS operator, where we play in this space, for something that might be harmful content, child endangerment content, hate speech, those kinds of things, intellectual property disputes, all of those have other specific environments, legislation, regulations that deal specifically with those issues. And quite frankly, that's where those issues should be dealt with. Coming to get an ISP or a DNS operator to block a piece of the internet really needs to be a last resort. And let's make sure we do it in the right place first. And I think that this framework needs to take that into very serious consideration.
Great, thank you. And moving on from that, I do want to talk about, the principle of net neutrality, of course. And you kind of mentioned the slippery slope of blocking that has been brought up in some of the interventions. Do you think there could be, in the end, any sort of legal implications or challenges to this consultation? In the intervention stage, there was mention that this could potentially violate Section 36 of the Telecommunications Act, which for the most part prohibits control of content by ISPs. So do you see that sort of argument succeeding here, or where do you think it would go if that did become a much bigger part of the conversation?
Maybe Hannah, if you don't mind, if I could jump in from sort of a critical infrastructure perspective. I won't answer that question directly, but I think sort of the things that you're bringing up right now that the different panelists have brought up show why it's important that we're even having this conversation at all. And from the critical infrastructure perspective, this conversation is really important. Electricity, we provide essential services for Canadians, right? And I think, over the last year, we've been talking about how challenging the pandemic environment is, but I think even more challenging than that is sort of the evolving cybersecurity landscape. For example, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, they released their National Cyber Threat Assessment recently and found that cybercrime is one of the biggest cyber risks to Canadians. So that's things like ransomware and all these things that can be done via botnets, for example. And I think right now, as electricity companies and other critical infrastructures continue to modernize infrastructure networks to meet demands of customers and policymakers, And as we all deploy more devices that might communicate through the internet, so the industrial Internet of Things, secure internet and secure cellular services are only going to become more important for everybody. So it's important that we're having these conversations, and they're not necessarily easy conversations to have either, because I think, as you guys have already noted, there might be privacy implications. There are questions about who decides what is blocked and what is not, what is the best way to do it. But I think it's important that we're having these conversations, and these forums like this can help us work through some of these questions as well. So maybe with that, I'll let one of my other panelists answer the harder questions about what this might mean more on a legal perspective.
And thank you for bringing that up. That's absolutely somewhere I wanted to go with this as well. And perhaps I can table my other question for a second here. But like you said, that is another part of it. What goes into this on that technical side? Like, for me, when I was learning about botnets and how blocking them works, I was trying to figure out, is this happening constantly in the background? Is this kind of like a one-off thing, like you recognize a threat and you're working to stop it? So with something like this, if we're really paying attention to all of this and working harder on it, what goes into that? Can you kind of tell me a bit more about what might be required for, ISPs or others who maybe haven't taken any steps yet to get into this?
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things that came up was sort of that you need the ability to distinguish between sort of malicious botnets and distributed computing and sort of other legitimate traffic. I think, just as an example, some companies might start using mesh networks, which can look like botnets, but aren't. So I think that as we look into sort of regulations or actions, we need to sort of make sure it supports the evolution of computing and wireless communications, which includes distributed computing, cloud computing, but not leaving the door open to malicious actors as well.
Perfect. And so bouncing back to the legal question, basically what I'm wondering is, do you think that this could potentially be challenged in the future? If this framework does fall into place, and where might those concerns for net neutrality fall at that point?
Well, I don't know if Andy and Tech Savvy certainly spent their time in court. They might have something to say on this. But one thing I do just want to highlight too is in the Act itself, in the Telecoms Act itself, in Section 36, is fairly specific that the CRTC needs to allow or to approve of any form of blocking. So it's not outright disallowed, of course, but what it does say is they need to approve any form of blocking. And, essentially, I think that's speaking more to content, right? The Canadian carriers should not control or adversely affect content. That probably wasn't written, well, we know it wasn't written given the age of the Act, with the idea of botnets in mind. However, at the end of the day, we could argue that nevertheless, even if it's malicious, this is content on the internet. And so as a result, the CRC does have a role that they must play here in some way, shape, or form, because the Act is actually prescriptive here, and they need in some way, shape, or form to address it. Now, I'm not saying how they should address it. I think most of us in this space recognize this is a relatively old piece of legislation governing now an environment that it never even contemplated when it was written. So all of these issues do get kind of bundled up into what we're facing right now. Some of them being the technical legal.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I can talk a little bit about the legal framework at play here. I guess I would caution right off the bat against thinking of this as an old piece of legislation that's governing new technology. The Telecommunications Act is fairly principle based, and I would argue very robust that way. So Section 36 is not about voice communication. It is a very principled statement of common carriage, and the idea that carriers, just carry the bits, carry the signals, and don't influence the content. So I think that has stood the test of time, and I think it's just as applicable to the internet as it was to voice services. It's true that the commission can approve of, carriers influencing content. It's less clear that the commission can require carriers to control content. And this is certainly something that the commission dealt with in a copyright related application where some of the media companies were asking the CRTC to require ISPs to block copyright infringing websites. And that was called a fair play, that application. And one of the reasons that it failed was because the CRTC does not have the authority to require ISPs to block this kind of content. That's not to say that they could not require or encourage ISPs to block malicious botnet content. They certainly may be able to do that, similarly to what they're doing on the voice services side. So the other legal framework that this comes up against or recalls is the ITMP framework, Internet Traffic Management Practices, which is really about, allowing ISPs to manage content online in certain circumstances. The focus there is not about malicious activity. The focus is about managing volumes of content where the ISP, needs to have the facilities in place to carry that capacity. So it's a bit of a different context, but I think that it applies here. The ITMP framework allows ISPs in, urgent situations in order to maintain the health of their networks to just do what they need to do. That's just allowed. Beyond that, where ISPs decide to, this comes from the days of throttling Napster, but it's the same thing with, say, BitTorrent or other things. If an ISP needs to throttle particular content because they don't have the capacity in place yet, the ITMP framework allows them to do that, but they have to be transparent about it. They need to disclose it to their customers, and they need to disclose it to wholesale providers as well. The framework is designed to encourage ISPs to invest in the facilities so that they don't have to do that. And that is, in fact, what happened after that framework came into effect. And for a while, ISPs were generally not throttling traffic. Now, most of them, possibly all of the large carriers, are back to throttling some traffic in sort of in some circumstances at least. So I would say there's probably an opportunity, at least with botnets, to take some inspiration, I guess, from the ITMP framework. ISPs do need to block some content, some botnet activity. I'm thinking denial of service attacks, where you simply can't ignore that as an ISP. And that probably doesn't require the same degree of transparency and collaboration. Maybe it needs some best practices, but it's a bit of a different framework from identifying the particular malicious botnets that are distributing malware, ransomware attacks, or the kind of malware that distributes spam or is a threat to critical infrastructure. So yeah, I think it does take kind of teasing apart exactly what you're trying to get at, and then I think the tools are available if the CRTC wants to look into those.
Great. So at this point, great conversation, and of course, I'll always have more questions about things like this, but I do want to make sure that we have time to get to the audience questions. And before I get to those, I'll let you know that this is being recorded. It will be up on CIRA's YouTube page in about a week's time. So going over to the audience questions, the first one is there a free-to-use Canadian Bless source that lists ISPs of malicious hosts, or IPs of malicious hosts? Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I would say the short answer to that is yes, although maybe not quite in exactly the way it's framed in the question. But the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has their own threat feed that is very Canadian-centric that can be available. Obviously, and this is bias alert from CIRA here, but we also provide a free service called Canadian Shield, which is for individuals, that allows an individual in their home to effectively implement a very robust block list, of which the CCCS feed is one of the core feeds of that. So we do it in a sense at the domain level, as opposed to, in this question, the IP level, but the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity very much curates a Canadian threat feed. And they do some great work around that.
All right. And the next question says, since state actors are involved in various nefarious activities, isn't it reasonable that our state should be protecting Canadians? Again, if anyone wants to jump on these, just go for it.
I can talk to that one a little bit. Yeah, 100%. They should be one of many actors involved in protecting Canadians. These are complex issues and require a lot of different points of view, a lot of different skill sets. I mean, the reality is the state has the authority to protect its citizens, so they should certainly be involved in protecting Canadians. I believe they should be the only one. I go back to the most effective approach for cybersecurity is a collaborative one, right? That means that anyone who has a stake in ensuring the internet is secure has a responsibility to ensure that it's secure. It takes all of us. The weakest point on the internet is the end user simply not updating their software, simply not updating their machines. And the government certainly has a role to play, be it in education, maintaining lists of malicious hosts, you name it.
Thank you. And
maybe I'll just pile on the partnerships things that people are bringing up as well, and that CIRA Canadian Shield is a great example. I know Canadian electricity companies also really value partnerships with government and with other critical infrastructure sectors, including the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. And I think it's been mentioned here, sort of the cyber threats, they're evolving quickly. They change quickly. Threat actors are becoming more diverse and nefarious. So it's one of those things that, us like-minded people, we all have to work together. We all have a responsibility to ensuring sort of the internet is safe, critical infrastructure is safe. So I think now more than ever we need to be doing that. And I think this includes more than just questions of blocking. It includes things like sort of deepening support for cybersecurity information and intelligence sharing programs. In sort of an appropriate way, continuing to train a cyber workforce. I think you talked about the end user is often the most sort of dangerous thing on the internet. So, how do we make sure more people are cyber smart online? And it continues to have these conversations regarding sort of the security of IoT devices and supply chain cybersecurity. So this is why it's, again, so important we're having these conversations where you have sort of government talking, you have regulators talking, you have internet providers talking, telecoms, and I think all these voices are going to be important to coming up with solutions for some of these tough problems.
And the third question says, don't you think that government should sponsor research, public knowledge, and literacy about internet threats instead of stepping in with internet governance? In my honest opinion, net neutrality is essential, and hard regulations may damage it badly. Anyone want to take that one?
Well, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I guess, I mean, I think that government does have involvement in all of those areas. There is certainly, research that happens into botnets. I'm sure there's funded research about botnets and network level threats. CCCS does this. There are other bodies as well that, look at and consider botnets. So I don't think this is the only thing that is going on, this CRTC consultation on a framework for mandated blocking. So I guess I would warn against that. And I would agree that I think network neutrality is an important consideration here, and I also hope that doesn't get lost in looking at solutions like this.
Yeah,
I think go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was just going to quickly say, there's actually a lot in that question. Yes, the government should be involved in research. Yes, the government should be involved in public education. I think the education part of it could be our most effective tool, right? Teaching basic cyber hygiene could be our most effective tool in battling botnets. I also know that there is a role for governments within internet governments, just a fact. And the last part of it is also true. Harsh regulations will affect innovation, will affect the operations of the internet, and can do harm. But the government absolutely has a role in all of this.
Thank you. And Byron, was it you that also had something you wanted to say? Or?
Well, actually, Mark covered a lot of the ground that I was going to go with. But the one thing I just did want to really reinforce was at the education level, and particularly for the public school age, whether it's K to 8 or through high school, literacy, right? Literacy is absolutely critical. And just by dint of circumstance, I've done a number of sessions in high schools, just providing kind of background information on the internet and how it works, probably unsurprisingly. And it is shocking to me every time how able, in this case, it's usually teenagers, are to use the surface level technology, right? The layer 7, the stuff that we see and think of as internet, and yet how little actual knowledge about the internet that the average teenager has, particularly when it comes to protecting themselves and what's actually happening on the internet when it comes to malicious activity. And I think that those kinds of literacy programs would make a huge difference to the overall security. Because at the end of the day, yes, machines can get us into trouble and do bad things, but at the end of the day, any true, very robust cybersecurity posture of an organization or an environment, it always comes down to the people. You've got to educate the people. They have to have high literacy levels to be able to go out there on the open internet. I mean, we force our teenagers to go get a 3-level license and go through a pretty significant driver's ed program to get on the road. And yet, arguably, the internet has as many harms, and we just set them free with literally nothing. And I think that is one of the areas where all levels of government, as citizens and parents and taxpayers, should be demanding it, but levels of government, and in this case, typically provincial, should absolutely be doing more on this front, which would have, albeit a longer term solution, significant impact on the overall security posture of the internet in Canada.
All right. And the next question is, could blocking botnets affect real people and companies that are not aware of infections on their systems and bring other problems in the future? Again, if anyone wants to jump on that.
I can jump in. I think it's worth sort of reiterating at the front end, sort of, I guess, why we're even sort of having this conversation about why we should even be blocking botnets. And I think, just as a reminder, sort of botnets can be used for sort of a variety of more nefarious purposes on the web. So whether that to be conduct distributed denial of service attacks, to spread ransomware, for example. We saw like a very big example of a ransomware attack with Colonial Pipeline recently, to spread malware, to conduct fraud campaigns, to send spam, to steal data. There's a lot of different things, bad things that botnets can help the bad guys do online. So having ways in place, whether that be blocking botnet frameworks or anything else that can help make the internet a little bit safer for Canadians, it's probably a good thing and a good conversation to at least start and have. So it's sort of like, you need your kid to go through many different levels of driver's ed before they can get on the road, but we also want to make sure the car is really safe as well and the speed limits are correct, while not making everybody go too slow or traffic jams at the same time too.
Great. And next, on the topic of blocking, of course, how would this be limited to just malicious botnet traffic versus used for copyright or other non-malicious botnet traffic?
This is that slippery slope I mentioned earlier. By having a content blocking regime in place for one thing, it becomes easier to implement it for other things, copyright infringement and any number of other things. Michael Geist has done some incredible writing on content blocking as the new big policy question for Canada moving forward, because of Andy mentioned Bell's Fair Play proposal. We've got the copyright framework. Minister Guilbeault's pending online harms legislation. He confirmed that there will be blocking in that, although I don't think he'll get it introduced to the House by the time the House rises this term, but we'll see. I mean, it is a slippery slope. Once it's done for one thing, it becomes much easier to do it for another.
Yeah, and in fact, that's not really even hypothetical in this particular case, because one of the interventions in the CRTC's consultation here was from Super Channel, who were already champing at the bit to, implement botnet blocking and make sure that, and they asked the CRTC to do it in a way that could also be used for copyright enforcement. So, at least for some people, it is not just a slippery slope, but it's the same. It's the same field.
Yeah, it's not just the slippery slope. It's the thin edge of the wedge for a player like that. Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons as I think hopefully most of our members know, CIRA has made a submission into this consultation. And that's one of the key points that we make is any framework must be laser focused, so it helps prevent exactly what the two prior speakers have just spoken about. And it really needs to focus on harm to the network. And it's about, if we're going to talk about botnets and the network, it's about harming the network. In a sense, the network harming itself. And there, a very narrow way, there may be an opportunity for an appropriate blocking framework. But that has to be made explicitly clear. Otherwise, we are just, slowly, if not quickly, walking our way towards the slippery slope that both Andy and Mark just spoke about.
Thank you. And the next one is a bit more of a statement, but says ISPs should throttle customers whose computers are involved with botnets until the customer takes steps to fix it. How this might fall in the education realm or something else, but how do you think ISPs could alert their customers to the fact that this is happening, and what might they be expected to do if that's the case?
I think that's a pretty... Oh, Andy, it's the ISP. You go ahead.
Well, I just, this suggests a particular way of providing internet service. And there's sort of a lot assumed here. So I'm thinking as an ISP, if I wanted to do this, I would now have to monitor all of my users' internet traffic. And I guess, how do I identify what the malicious botnet activity is in order to pick which customers to throttle? I mean, maybe I now log every interaction, all the traffic that every customer does. That's a lot. Maybe I just log the kind of protocols that they use, how much usage that, how much traffic they generate. Like, this is a lot of information that ISPs do not generally track. At least I can say TechSavvy does not monitor what our users do online. So we would have no way to have this information. Maybe we would respond to third-party requests. Somebody would write to us and say, these particular users appear to be generating botnet traffic. Well, now as an ISP, how do I respond to that? I could contact those customers and let them know that their systems may be infected, but I also don't really have the systems in place. We don't provide the botnet or antivirus software or anything. So it's sort of another line of business there. I could inform them and I could throttle them for some amount of it. It just basically opens a can of worms about how to address this. And it's, we're not there yet. We're still at a stage where the CRTC is sort of identifying this as a concern, and we're exploring the ways that ISPs could help the environment as a whole, as opposed to focusing on sort of the individual users.
Great. And somebody else has asked, can the application of internet security be simplified for small business owners who are managing their own websites? Anybody have a take on that?
I mean, I think one of the challenges for small business owners, and probably the average individual too, is in a sense a plethora of options on this. And what are you actually protecting? Because most good cyber protection is a multi-layered defense, right? Whether it's some sort of DNS firewall on the outer perimeter, maybe a hard firewall to fall back into, other applications that people would know, like Norton Antivirus or those types of things in the actual environment, whether it's an individual or small business. And then, of course, as I already said, the most important one is the end user. At the end of the day, it's usually the end users who are the catalyst for something bad happening. So I think that, two of the key things that most small businesses should be doing is some kind of firewall. And again, Bias Alert, we do provide one, but whether it's ours or someone else's, Canadian Shield is ours, something that protects that outer perimeter, and then training. And it's not very sexy, but it's very true. People have to be aware. They have to have those basic digital literacy skills, and in this case, digital literacy cyber skills, in order to help protect themselves and not click on that link. I mean, it seems so basic, and we've been drumming that message home for years and years and years now, but it's people clicking on that link that does so much of the damage. And the bad actors, I mean, to their credit, they're sophisticated, they're creative, they're persistent, they're novel. They keep coming up with new and different ways. But getting trained one day doesn't mean you're trained for all time. It's about ongoing training. And it doesn't have to be, you're not taking month-long courses or anything here, but it has to be ongoing, regular tune-ups for the average small business owner's staff in particular. And there are a few good and even a few Canadian-centric services that provide that kind of a service. And more I think businesses just have to accept this is now a cost of doing business. It's unfortunate, I agree, but it's a cost of doing business, because trying to fix it once the horse is out of the barn, reeling it back in is very, very expensive.
And perhaps on this topic of, the speed with which things change, someone else has asked, how could such a framework work at the speed of botnets, for example, Flux networks, given all the proposed oversight? Anybody want to grab that one?
Yeah, just quickly, the oversight, the focus on one area, not the entire cybersecurity ecosystem, and a top-down mandated regime doesn't make for an agile approach. And what's really needed is an agile approach. Like I say, botnets mutate, people move servers, IP addresses change. So we need to have a much more fast-acting system, and that's where I come back to, the idea of a collaborative security approach as opposed to that top-down mandated approach, right? Ensuring that everyone's playing their part to keep the entire system safe.
Thank you. And another question says, botnets often exploit vendor vulnerabilities. Why doesn't the government focus on incentivizing vendors to secure instead, as the United States is doing?
I mean, I guess we don't have a government representative on this panel to speak to that. I think that seems to me that it's an important part of the puzzle, and I hope that they are doing that.
I think you might have been muted. So could you repeat yourself?
I'm sorry. Just that, I think that it is an important part of the puzzle for the government to, or for vendors to be encouraged to secure systems. That is would be an effective way, especially as we look at more Internet of Things sort of threats. And so that's different from what the CRTC is doing here, and it's different from the CRTC's jurisdiction, regulatory jurisdiction, but it's an important part of the puzzle for securing systems.
Thank you. And sorry, go ahead, but keep in mind that we're nearing the end here.
I'll be really quick. In our submission, we did recommend that something like a voluntary anti-botnet code for ISPs be established, and that ISPs who sign on to that code receive safe legal haven from damages done by botnets on their networks.
Perfect. And this might be the last one, so keep that in mind. Somebody else has asked, my ISP has implemented spam blocking that is sending a small percentage of my legitimate email to the spam folder. Should a person be able to opt out or opt in? We did kind of discuss this a bit, but would someone else like to speak to that again?
Yeah, I mean, so this is sort of different from the botnets, but in terms of opting out and opting in, I guess the question's sort of related. One answer I think is if your ISP is implementing a technology or a service that you don't like, we need to have enough competition that you can move to an ISP who does provide the kinds of services that you like. So I think that is at least one important part of this. An ISP, I think, could transparently disclose that this is a service that they do for all of their traffic. And as long as there's enough competitive options, you should be able to move along. But, I think, and sort of realizing that time is very short, I guess maybe as a parting comment, I would say I think that the CRTC, there are a lot of questions here. And it feels like the CRTC has, come out with this consultation that looks at a particular solution and asks for comments on that solution. But really, I think they have an opportunity to bring a lot of interested parties and experienced expertise together to share knowledge and explore this area. There are lots of regulatory issues where the CRTC does not go immediately to solutions, certainly not solutions that involve as much intervention as blocking, where they will spend sometimes years basically studying, collecting information before they go to sort of implementing solutions. I think the CRTC really has an opportunity here because exactly, the ISPs who are ultimately involved in this are under their jurisdiction, and they do have some forums that they could use to bring those parties together to discuss these issues and understand the landscape better before we jump to regulatory solutions.
All right, and I do quickly want to ask one more question just so we've got time, and it's that without government intervention, how do you suggest that ISPs are encouraged to invest in protecting their clients? Anybody want to take that?
Well, there's a lot of ISP questions here, so take Andy off the hook there for a moment. One ISP question after another. But, you know, in a competitive landscape, so there's an assumption there that it's a decently competitive landscape. You know, customers are going to want to be protected as kind of the base foundation of the service that an ISP can offer, I think. Certainly in some of the research that we do, that's what we see. And from that perspective, and in a competitive environment, if ISPs aren't competitive in providing a secure service, a secure environment, end users have the option to go elsewhere because, you know, as we've seen, cybersecurity is becoming a more and more high-profile topic with greater awareness in the citizenry. And barely a day goes by now where some cyber-related breach or issue is not on the front page, or at least very close to the front page. So if ISPs fail to provide secure environments, end users are going to go find an environment that is secure. And I think that's fundamentally going to be the number one way that ISPs act to ensure a secure environment for their customers. Key assumption there is enough competition.
Well, great. Thank you for that. And like I said, that's going to have to be the last question. We've run out of time. But I'd like to thank all of the panelists for being here and sharing your insight.